Hello, everyone. If you are here for the webinar, The Toxic Relationship, Alcohol and Eating Disorders, you are in the right place. As everyone gets logged in, feel free to pop into the chat where you all are zooming in from. And then throughout the webinar, we do have a Q&A feature, so please feel free to utilize that to ask any questions or interact with the material via the chat. We'll be taking questions towards the end and during the webinar as it is relevant to the material. My name is Taylor. I am the lead intake coordinator here at Balance, and I will be your moderator for today. Just a little bit about Balance. So we are an outpatient facility with levels of care ranging from PHP, IOP, we have Saturday programs and group programs as well. So thank you for taking the time to log on today and learn more about this topic. Just by tuning in, you're putting energy towards learning more about yourself and getting support that you or someone you know may need. You're in the right place and you're definitely welcome here, so we're happy to have you with us. If you have any sort of questions during the presentation, please submit them through the Q&A panel. We will be answering a few questions along the way as it is relevant to the material, but we definitely have time at the end for questions as well. Utilize the chat to share any thoughts and reactions to the material. We'll also be sharing additional resources and info in the chat along the way, so keep an eye out for that. So don't be shy, we love hearing from you all and we want to connect with you. A little bit more about Balance. So we are a premier eating disorder treatment center offering boutique outpatient treatment options using evidence-based practices. So this means we're able to provide the highest clinician to client rate in New York City, giving you fully customized treatment options that best fit you or your loved ones in recovery. And now I'd like to present to you our two presenters for today. Laura, our lead admissions therapist and licensed social worker with a background in research and substance use disorder treatment. And then we also have Jillian, a PhD candidate with her bachelor's in psychobiology and master's in research psychology with a concentration in substance use counseling. Jillian is a published researcher and intake coordinator here at Balance, and I will pass it off to them.
All right, so to start, this is what we can expect from today's presentation. We're going to unpack the signs of a substance use disorder. Maybe you can see this in yourself, or maybe you're here for a loved one. We're going to explore the language that we use to talk about substance use disorders and eating disorders, reveal the links, the factors that contribute to the development of a substance use disorder. And then we're going to talk about potential avenues for treatment for a dual diagnosis that we'll get into. And then also we will give you examples going forward, so you have something to relate to on a more practical level. All right, so why does this matter? So of people diagnosed with an eating disorder, 50% of those individuals use substances. This isn't people who necessarily have a substance use disorder. We will get into that statistic, but 50% of people diagnosed with an eating disorder do use substances recreationally. So what is a substance use disorder? Substance use disorder is a mental disorder, but it affects multiple aspects of a person's life. It affects their brain and their physiology. It also affects their behaviors. And it also involves being unable to control the use of the substance. So you might use it in risky situations. We'll also get into this. At the end of the day, if you're using a substance and it significantly affects you in your everyday life, then this could be diagnosed as a substance use disorder. Okay, so what are the risk factors, right? What are the factors that together are making it more likely to develop a substance use disorder? So to start, we want to go over in detail a little bit about what contributes to a substance use disorder diagnosis. So as you see in the upper left-hand corner, the first aspect of it is impaired control. So before I get into that, I do want to say this is from the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th version. This is what clinicians use to diagnose substance use disorders, and it is considered the gold standard. So we're going to go over these symptoms. So in terms of impaired control, this means that you are unable to control your substance use, right? So examples of this would be using the substance in larger quantity and for a longer period of time than you intend to. This could also look like difficulty cutting down on that substance use. So you're using it a certain quantity and you can't cut down on it. And you might have strong cravings to use. And these are indications that you have impaired control. And then we're going to go down to the risky use. Risky use means that you're using the substance in a dangerous environment. So this might be the place that you're using, the people you're using with, and that you're continuing to use despite physical or psychological consequences, negative consequences. So for example, if you are drinking with liver disease, that's a risky use, right? Because you're continuing to use despite the physical consequence, right? And then we'll go over to the pharmacological criteria, and this is more biological. So tolerance. Tolerance can mean 2 different things. One of them is over a period of time, you're using the same amount of a substance, but you're not getting the same intoxicated effect. So that's tolerance. Tolerance might also look like is that you're using more and more each time you use to get that same intoxicated effect that you got when the first time that you use that substance. So those are 2 ways tolerance can come up. And then the other biological criteria is withdrawal. So when you stop using the substance, you have something physical happens. So you might get a headache, you might get tremors. Those are just some examples of when you stop using, and then you're seeing these medical consequences. Yes. And then the 4th category is social impairment, which is a really important category, which, like I said in the beginning, it means that one of 3 things. The substance is negatively affecting your responsibilities at work and school. So maybe you're late, maybe you're not showing up. Social impairment can also mean problems in your relationships with loved ones and at home. So maybe all of your money is going to substances. Maybe that's causing problems at home with your loved ones. And then the 3rd one is social impairment. So the activities that you once loved to do, you're no longer showing up for them. Maybe there's a recreational sport that you play with your friends, you're no longer showing up to those. So you don't need all of these symptoms to get a diagnosis. It's actually a spectrum. So the more symptoms you endorse, the more severe your substance use disorder will be diagnosed. So it's on a scale from mild to moderate to severe. All right, so we are getting into the factors that lead to a substance use disorder. So when it comes to substance use, 50% of the reason why you may develop a substance use disorder is because of genetics. And to put that in perspective, if you line up all of the factors that contribute to a substance use disorder, so genetics, psychological, behavioral, physiological, 50% of that is genetics, and everything else is the other 50% that contributes to the development of a substance use disorder. So it is very genetic. Another way to think about this is that an alcohol use disorder, which is just a type of substance use disorder, is 3 to 4 times higher for individuals with close relatives who have a substance use disorder. So if you have a parent, you have a sibling that has a substance use disorder, you are 3 to 4 times more likely to also develop that. And also another statistic that shows how powerful this is that if you take a child at birth that comes from a family with substance use disorders and you put them into a foster family, they still have the same likelihood of developing that substance use disorder. It's still 3 times more likely, even if you don't grow up in that environment. Okay. So other potential factors contributing to substance use disorders. Like I said, it's genetics, that's 50% of it. There's also environmental factors. So if you grow up with parental modeling, if you grow up and you see your parents using, you are more likely to use. There's also, if you are more impulsive to begin with, that also poses a risk for developing an SUD. So that's a behavior, for example. And then there are more like physiological / psychological, so like a stress response. If you have a high amount of stress, you might use substance as a way to lessen the stress, both psychologically and physiologically. So there are many factors that contribute to a substance use disorder. To review, it's genetics, it's psychological, it's behavioral, and it's social. It's not one thing that causes a disorder. And we can say that, you know, this isn't your fault if you develop a substance use disorder. It mostly is a genetic condition, actually.
All right, I'll take it over from here. So we've talked about some prevalence statistics here in the population. We've talked about warning signs, and we've talked about criteria. Now I want to move towards how this plays out in real life. How do we cope with these emotions, these stressful situations? What is harmful coping? What does that look like? And then what are some alternatives? How do we disrupt these unhealthy coping cycles in our lives? All right, so when coping turns against you. So first, what is maladaptive coping? Maladaptive coping is when the behavior does not resolve the problem in the long term and can actually increase the overall harm. Substance use disorders and eating disorders are encapsulated in this. Other examples can look like rumination. So rumination can be perseverating on negative thoughts, whether they're past or present, and causing more emotional distress in the long term. Can also look like emotional numbing, so shutting your feelings down to provide relief from stress and anxiety, not accessing those feelings, putting that wall up and not processing them. Can also look like self-harm and isolation. Where I've seen this play out in my work is maybe someone is using alcohol and has a substance use disorder and they're trying to cope with work stress. I've seen impacted job performance. I've seen people lose their jobs due to their substance use disorder. I've seen people be mandated to treatment and have to engage in treatment in order to keep their job, or they have to work with an EAP. So really seeing that that maladaptive coping strategy is increasing the overall harm in their life and impacting the overall quality of life in the long term. All right, so what is healthy coping? So this list isn't exhaustive at all, and it's not mutually exclusive either, right? We want to have many coping strategies that we can engage in and many ones, and have that toolkit, right? So just for simplicity purposes, I'm going to break it down in these two sections. So problem-based coping and emotion-based coping. So problem-based coping is when you need to change your situation, perhaps by removing that stressful component in your life, and that you can change that situation. It's something you want to change and can change, right? That can look like an unhealthy work environment. That can look like an unhealthy relationship. How do you reduce that stress and engage in problem-based coping there? You can set healthy boundaries. You can change your job. And by doing so, you can reduce that overall dysregulation you're experiencing. Then we have emotion-based coping. So emotion-based coping is when you need to manage your negative feelings and you either don't want to change the situation or you can't control that situation, right? That can look like engaging in a hobby. That can look like art, meditation, relaxation techniques, mindfulness, deep breathing, journaling, aromatherapy, all of those things, right? So we want to use a combination. Let's say you love engaging in art, but you're in distress on the subway, right? You want to have multiple things that you can use to regulate your emotions no matter what situation you're in. So I want you guys to think about, maybe jot down or put in the chat, what is maybe one of your favorite coping strategies you engage in, and maybe one that you haven't engaged in that you want to try. And talk about it. Okay, I see journaling in there. That's a great one. Rock climbing, nature walks. Yes, nature, things involving the senses, right? Getting outside. Yes. Fantastic. Okay. Being with animals. That's a great one. Okay. What about ones maybe you guys haven't engaged in a while that maybe you want to try? Trying journaling, yes. Turning off the phone, setting boundaries there with that, right? Putting on do not disturb, putting it in a separate location, maybe away from your bed in your bedroom. Disconnecting, love it. Okay, thank you all. Okay, now we'll talk about defining the difference, right? Looking at eating disorders alongside substance use.
Yes, so to begin, we want to define what comorbidity is. Comorbidity is simply one person who is diagnosed with 2 or more disorders from the DSM, right? So for example, you can be diagnosed with an eating disorder and then have a comorbid substance use disorder. Actually, of all individuals diagnosed with anorexia, 27% of them have a comorbid substance use disorder. And out of everyone diagnosed with bulimia, almost 37% of those people have a substance use disorder. And then again, for binge eating, out of everyone diagnosed with binge eating disorder, about 23% of those people do have a substance use disorder. So what this might tell us is that there may be some relationship, right, between the two. Right. So the stigma, right? Why do we keep using substances? So the reason that we start using substances may be different from the reasons that we continue using it. So we'll get into that in this section. Okay. So as time goes on, the substance use disorder evolves as well. So for example, when you start using a substance, I'm sure people have heard the term dopamine plenty. When you use a substance, there's a dopamine that's released in your brain when you consume it. But as time goes on, actually dopamine starts getting released before you even use the substance, right? So if you're in a place that you usually use, you will get a dopamine release because your body is used to the association. So if you have a preparation before you use a substance, the dopamine will eventually get released as you're preparing to use the substance. So the more that this dopamine is released around your substance use, the stronger the substance use becomes, the stronger the impulse to use becomes. Another example of this is the frontal lobe, which has a huge responsibility in inhibition. So when someone uses the substances, there are many substances that may impair temporarily your inhibition, right? So you might become more impulsive when you're intoxicated or whatever the case may be. But as you use that consistently as time goes on, you're actually damaging those cells in the frontal lobe. So you're ultimately damaging memory and planning and these other tasks that the frontal lobe is responsible for. So this is just showing biologically, why you begin using and continue to use, it evolves. All right. And then one more is the stigma. So stigma is another factor of why we continue to use for a different reason than why we started.
All right, so let's talk about how we see this in action, right? So unfortunately, despite how prevalent both substance use disorders are and eating disorders are in our population, there's still a lot of societal stigma, right? And what happens when we have stigma regarding these conditions? It fuels the maintenance of these disorders. So if someone is fearful of being stigmatized or they're already experiencing stigma, oftentimes they experience shame as well. And what happens when shame is experienced? A lot of times secrecy can be involved, right? I've worked with clients struggling with both substance use disorders and eating disorders that are suffering alone because of that fear and of that stigmatization. And then that can oftentimes lead to minimizing what you're going through, right? Minimizing the extent of the eating disorder symptoms, the amount you're drinking, the physical symptoms that you're reporting to doctors, or the duration and the impact that it's having on your life. And in terms of the stigma, we really want to push back on this, right? You don't have to do this alone. And there are things that we can just do in our everyday language in a minute to just push back against that stigma, and then continue to encourage people to seek recovery and know that recovery is possible. Okay, so let's talk now about changes in language that we can all incorporate to reduce stigma, fight stereotypes around eating disorders and substance use disorders. Okay. So shifting the perspective, those who suffer from an eating disorder or a substance use disorder may be labeled as having a quote unquote addictive personality. I know that's something that's often, said in our society in everyday language, but as Jillian stated already, it's so much deeper than that, right? It's biological, it's psychological, it's physiological, and it's a social response. There's no one personality type that leads to an addiction. It's not a moral or character flaw. Everyone is deserving of recovery and treatment. It's not just a matter of willpower and self-discipline, which we hear a lot of. Okay, how can we talk about this? So what I really want to hit on here is we want to move away from the thought that people are their diagnoses or their conditions, right? There are many other traits, qualities, and parts that make us who we are that are inherent to our identity outside of our conditions. And by using person-first language, we can fight that stigma. So a person is a person with a substance use disorder instead of labeling them as an addict or a junkie, right? Person may be engaging in problematic substance use instead of a drug habit. Someone may be substance free, they may be abstinent or sober instead of using the terms like clean. When we use terms like clean, that can, be associated with good or bad, and we want to move away from that. And then a person is a person with anorexia, they are not an anorexic. Using people first language helps us identify with the person and the individual, not just solely their disorder. All right, let's talk a little bit about recovery and what recovery looks like, right? Recovery isn't linear. So both in eating disorder recovery and substance use disorder recovery, challenges, slips, they're both often common and a lot of times a part of the recovery process, right? I'll let Jillian go look at the graph here in a little bit. She's our stats girl, but from a therapist perspective too, this is a chance when a slip happens, can be a learning moment, right? That's where you work with your team, you process it, you analyze it, you see what happened, take that information and apply it to the next challenging situation. We want to get away from that all or nothing thinking, right? Like, oh, a slip happens and, you know, you want to keep on going and continue to pursue recovery because it is possible.
Definitely. And I think with this graph, it's a very ambiguous graph, but you can put any symptom, like Laura said, you can put any diagnosis in this, and recovery is always has its ups and has its down. The important thing is that you talk to your treatment team about it and you continue to try to make progress.
All right, let's take it one step further here and talk about the specific links and connections between anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and alcohol use disorders and alcohol. On the surface, they may seem like very different conditions, but there's a lot of similarities. I like to think about the root, right? We talked about those maladaptive coping strategies, right? You know, eating disorder symptoms and alcohol use disorder symptoms can serve as, you know, that function to provide temporary relief from maybe depression, anxiety, trauma. But in the long run, they increase harm and the chances of harm and impact the quality of life. Okay, how does alcohol use disorder show up in anorexia? So individuals suffering from both anorexia and an alcohol use disorder may further restrict to compensate for the calories consumed in alcohol. So if you're already struggling with restricted intake and alcohol is added on top of that, you may also compensate with behaviors such as excessive exercise, making yourself feel sick. You also may use alcohol to cope with the depression, anxiety, and the stress that's from your eating disorder symptoms. A little bit further as well, the next day after alcohol use, you often feel sick, nauseous, and that can further impact your ability to, you know, consume calories and adequately nourish yourself, right? Due to that cycle. And this is unfortunately very common in younger populations, college-age students. I think I've read a statistic that 1/3 of college-age women actually restrict their intake before a night of drinking. A little bit further on the impacts too, it's dangerous because it can increase your risk of alcohol poisoning, memory loss, and alcohol-related injuries. Alcohol can actually also impact your body's ability to absorb vitamins, so that can put you at further risk for medical complications. All right, the complexities of bulimia and alcohol use. So first, just a brief, you know, explanation. Those with bulimia and an alcohol use disorder frequently binge both food and alcohol and may purge both as well. There is a medication used to treat alcohol use disorders and alcohol dependence called disulfiram. That's also called referred to as anabuse. That's a generic term there. And the difficulty there is if you drink on anabuse, you can get physically ill. So that really highlights the importance of treating both the substance use disorder and the eating disorder, because we don't want to increase the risk of those compensatory behaviors as well. Alcohol also may be used to cope with negative feelings from eating disorder symptoms and those struggling with bulimia. They can also be used to induce compensatory behaviors. There's also research to show that reward pathways in the brain, like Jillian touched on already, when engaging in binge purge episodes are also active when you're using substances. I've worked with many clients, just to give an example, they often report to me that drinking in excess increases the likelihood of experiencing their eating disorder symptoms with binging and purging. A little bit more on the harm as well. Adolescents with bulimia that drink heavily have an increased likelihood of participating in high-risk behaviors. So going back to that harm piece, right? Increased risk of harm. All right, let's go more into binge eating and how that interplays with alcohol. So binge eating and drinking can offer feelings of temporary dissociation or reprieve. I work with clients and they tell me that, you know, when they're engaging in a binge eating episode or drinking alcohol to excess, it has the same effect. You know, they want to numb out, they want to just escape for a moment, right? And what's really central here is that feeling of loss and control with both food and alcohol. Alcohol, like Jillian said too, impacts the brain, lowers that impulse control. So if your impulse control and your decision making is impacted when you're engaging in alcohol use, that can increase the likelihood of a binge as well. People also may be using alcohol to cope with negative feelings after a binge. And then in both populations, there's a risk of increased tolerance and with the substances consumed as well. And if your intake with food is increased, you may need to drink more to get the same effect, which can lead to further medical complications as well. Additionally, up to 57% of men with binge eating disorder also have a co-occurring substance use problem. Right. So this is a great moment to take a pause and answer some questions you guys may have, but there's a few questions on the slide here that are often common, right? So I'll go through them and then we can open it up for more questions that you guys have. So the first one here is, what if drinking is the only way I get out of the house and socialize? The therapist in me kicks in, I might answer that question with more questions, right? Does, you know, that social group that you're engaging in the drinking behavior with, have you asked them if you can do any other behavior or event with them? Are they supportive of your recovery? When you went out, did that have a positive impact or a negative impact? So really taking a look at, you know, the intention and then the impact it's had on your life. And then how am I supposed to cope with, find coping strategies that work for me? I love this question, right? That's where we come in. Let us help. You know, it can be trial and error. The treatment professionals are there to work with you and be collaborative in your recovery, right? And if a coping strategy that doesn't work for you, at least you have that information, right? You know, I tried this, it doesn't work. Let's try something else next time. And then the next question is, isn't it better to take in those calories from drinking rather than no calories at all? I am not a doctor, but drinking on an empty stomach actually increases your risk for alcohol poisoning. So it can be very dangerous. And then, like I said earlier, it can also further disrupt the eating patterns the next day due to feeling ill. Alrighty, open up some questions to the Q&A if you guys have any.
Right, if there are no questions, then we can go ahead, but feel free to use the Q&A. If any questions come up, we can answer it as we go. So in substance use treatment, there are two overarching philosophies and modes of treatment. The first one is harm reduction, and the other one is abstinence. You might have heard about one of them. We're going to go over to explain a little bit of the difference. So in terms of harm reduction is a mode of recovery that aims at reducing the negative consequences associated with your substance use, right? So in harm reduction, it's not necessarily the goal to stop using. It can be the goal, but the goal may be to use less. It may be to use less frequently. In addition to that, you want to reduce the negative consequences of when you use. So you might use with a friend, carry Narcan with you. So if something goes wrong, you can reverse it. This might even look like testing the substance to make sure that it is a pure substance and that there's nothing else in it. So harm reduction is a good mode for some people, not everyone. Sometimes abstinence might be a better goal. And Laura's going to talk about that.
Yeah. So abstinence, the goal of abstinence is no substance use whatsoever, right? So that's where it really differs from harm reduction. This may be necessary due to medical complications. Some jobs require it. The important thing to note here is specifically with alcohol, it absolutely requires medical supervision for detox. You know, a detox assessment is necessary, right? They'll assess your vitals, your symptoms, and let you know if you meet criteria for medical detox for alcohol. There is a major risk from just going cold turkey off of alcohol if you're physically dependent. There's a risk for withdrawal, and from withdrawal, you can experience elevated vitals and put yourself at risk for seizure and even death. So medical supervision, letting your providers know that this is a goal you have, and then taking those necessary steps is really important for your safety overall. And then the other thing here is that it's really important to receive parallel treatment. If you're contemplating recovery from an eating disorder or a substance use disorder, what we often see if you're only treating one, this phenomenon that we call in the clinical world as symptom swapping, right? So let's say you're, working on your substance use, you may experience increase in eating disorder symptoms and vice versa if you're not treating them simultaneously.
And the stages of change. So with substance use, it's a lot, like we said, it's not linear. It's not just straight to recovery. There's a lot of ups and downs. So you can also think of this in stages, and we call them stages of change. So there are 5 stages of change. Everyone goes through them differently. It's not necessarily going in the same order. People jump around, people enter each stage multiple times. It's totally valid. It's not linear.
All
So
right.
the first, go ahead.
Go ahead. For it, Jillian.
So the first stage is pre-contemplation. So pre-contemplation might look like someone in denial, might look like someone who is unaware that their substance use is causing significant impairment in their life. So the goal of this stage is just to build awareness. Sometimes some people need to hit a low in order to see it. Sometimes you have, your loved one sits you down to tell you, and sometimes you just have to figure it out on your own. And then the second stage is going to be contemplation. So contemplation is when you're thinking, you realize that you might have a problem, and now you're thinking about doing something about it. So I like that, you can, when your pros for change outweigh the cons of change. So if the benefits outweigh the cost, that's when you leave the contemplation stage. This is when you're thinking about maybe doing something about it. And I'll let Laura finish this off.
Yeah, next we have preparation, right? So that's really committing and making a plan towards that change, right? That can look like scheduling a consultation call with us, or booking an intake, or starting that recovery process, really making those first steps and taking, those steps to start your recovery. Then we have action, right? Implementing that treatment plan. You have a treatment plan, you're working with providers, you're revising that treatment plan, right? Finding coping strategies that really work for you and starting your recovery journey. Then we have maintenance. So integrating change into your lifestyle. So that can look like continued recovery. Let's say you start at one level of care and then you step down, right? To make sure that that change is really sustainable and can be maintained over the course of your life.
Right. And during the maintenance stage, you might have moments of slip up. That's totally fine. It happens. That's when we might go back to the preparation stage, maybe, reevaluate what, the course that we're taking with our providers, and then go back to the action stage. Like I said, it's not linear, so it is adaptable. And I also think stages of change is a great visual for both substance use disorders as well as eating disorders, and you might be in a different place for each disorder. So you might be in the contemplation stage for a substance use disorder, and you might be in the action stage for an eating disorder. That's totally valid. Like I said, it's not linear and there's no correct path. But if you do want to take a moment to think about yourself, maybe jot down what stage you are in, and what you can do to reach the next stage. And if you would like to share, you can feel free to put it in the chat. If you don't want to, that's totally fine too.
Okay, we don't have any questions in the chat or answers in the chat. We can move towards what does a recovery team look like, right? So a recovery team looks like multiple providers all working together, right? We see them on this wheel, right? They want to coordinate with you and each other to make sure that your treatment, there's continuity in it and that you have the best success. So it involves a primary care provider with that medical supervision, a registered dietitian, a therapist, Alcohol Anonymous, or another support group, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to find that community that's conducive to your recovery. It can look like Smart Recovery, Refuge Recovery, an outside group that just provides that support. And then another counselor that's, specialized in substance use disorder recovery, a psychiatrist, maybe a life coach, all of these providers working with you for your treatment and recovery. Okay, now let's talk about some resources we can provide to you and talk about too. So Balance offers free virtual support groups. Taylor can talk about that a little bit more at the end. They're typically twice a month on Friday and Saturday. There's a link there that you can use to register and join. We also have other webinars uploaded. You can talk to us in a discovery call. All of those are free resources. We also have handbooks that you can utilize. And then just in terms of alcohol use disorder and substance use disorder specific recovery groups, like I said, there are multiple groups you can join, one of them being Smart Recovery. So Smart Recovery is a peer-led group. They have, multiple resources, handbooks, and many different meetings that you can engage in. Abstinence is not required. There's also Refuge Recovery. They have online and in-person meetings. And then if you're looking for a treatment facility for your substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder, you can call the Office of Addiction and Services and Supports, called OASIS, right? They can direct you, if you call that Hope Line number, to a facility if you need a network or in a specific location to the appropriate treatment provider.
Alrighty, so now we're going to jump into some questions. So please feel free to throw in some questions in the Q&A feature, in the chat feature, whatever feels best for you, and we're going to jump into discussing some of them. Okay, so we have a question. So do you have any comments on the use of cannabis while in ED recovery? And if you would treat it the same as you would alcohol use, especially when used as an appetite enhancer?
It's a really great and common question we see, right? So in order to, treat both the substance use disorder and the eating disorder, we really want to do a full assessment and see what the impact is on your life and your recovery, right? Is that substance, that marijuana use, impacting your overall recovery? And if it is, how can we address that to make sure that recovery is sustainable and that you're getting the best care possible?
Joy also put into the chat that the SAFE Foundation and OASAS licensed outpatient facility in Brooklyn as a great resource for recovery. So thanks for sharing. All right, so I'm just going to jump into talking a little bit about our treatment programs. Please still filter in some questions as we will continue to answer them, or even just a comment or something that you're taking away from today's webinar. We'd love to hear from you. So a little bit more about balance. So we do offer 4 levels of care that fit into a comprehensive treatment program, offering the opportunity for the most seamless road to recovery. So we offer different levels of care. So we have our PHP, which is a partial hospitalization program. It's offered Monday through Friday from 7:45 a.m. to 2:15. We're offering both virtual and in person for that option. So during the admissions process, we'll discuss which is going to be the best option for you. Then we have our IOP program, which stands for Intensive Outpatient Program. So we actually have 2 tracks for this level of care. We have our day IOP program, and then we have our night IOP program. The daytime is completely virtual, Monday through Friday, 11 to 2:15. And then we have our night program, which is Monday, Wednesday, Thursday from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. We then have our Saturday program. So that runs every Saturday from 8:30 to 1:30. That is also completely virtual. And then we have individual nutrition counseling and outpatient groups. So these groups only happen once a week. We have a body image, we have a men's group, and we have a food and mood group. Body image and men's group are run by therapists, and then our food and mood group is run by a dietitian. In all levels of our care, we offer different therapy and nutrition groups, as well as the appropriate meals offered. You'll be linked with a case manager and a dietitian. So going back to what Laura was saying about having a comprehensive team, that's where it starts with us at Balance. And then those clinicians that you'll be linked with at Balance will then communicate and collaborate with your outpatient team. So if you have any questions or want to talk a little bit more individually about how these programs could help you at Balance, we have what's called a confidential discovery call. So you can talk with an intake coordinator, you could talk with an admissions therapist, and we could chat with you more about what options we have at Balance. We could give you some more information about what direction you can take individually and how we can support you in this process. Just want to say, if you have any questions, please let us know. Please pop them into the Q&A. So I do see a question about where can referrals be sent to. So you can send them over to our email, which I will pop into the chat, or our outreach manager directly, which I will also pop her email into the chat. Her name is Julie. So I will do both of those.
You will also put in the chat the link that you can click to schedule a confidential call. So please don't hesitate to schedule one if you want information or just individual conversation.
Also going to pop into the chat some of the links that Laura was talking about for our webinars. And so there's also a link that if you are a provider and want to sign up for our referral network, you can do so via that link as well. So we also have some free support groups. So again, Laura was talking a little bit more about this. We have them once or twice a month. The next one going to be on July 16th. They are either with our clinical director, our CEO and founder, Melanie Rogers, or our Vice President of Admissions and Clinical Services. They're a really great group to just see what it's like to participate in the group and see what it would be like to talk about your experience and just connect with others who are struggling with the same thing and get some peer support. Alrighty, so if there are no more questions, it was so lovely to have all of you stop by. We're so honored that you chose to spend this time with us, and we hope you enjoyed the webinar as much as we did.